Hi folks, David Jameson here, editor of conter.co.uk, and I'm continuing our conversations about the suspension of Jeremy Corbyn after his criticisms of the HRC report into anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, but doing so, of course, against the backdrop of historic events in the United States. As we speak, midday on Wednesday, Donald Trump is currently spinning arguments that the election process has been manipulated. So obviously, huge events are going on against, as the backdrop to this conversation. I was hoping I could maybe bring them in towards the end and link those things together. I hope not artificially, because I think that there are real overlaps between these sort of historic events. But first of all, I'm very glad to introduce Barnaby Raine. How are you doing, Barnaby?
Delighted to be here on this very strange day.
It's very odd. Barnaby is an intellectual historian and a socialist activist who has written and spoken widely on questions of racism and social movements and socialist politics and their historical relationship, including a recent article for Vashti magazine, where you spoke about the importance of Jeremy Corbyn's political worldview, which I suppose has been much maligned in recent years as being sinister and conspiratorial, and this has some kind of relationship to why he's been suspended, goes the argument. And I wanted to talk to you about this not only because it relates obviously to the issue of his suspension and what his real political project has been and why that matters to the left, but also because from the events that we can see unfolding around the world, I think that politics, though I disagree with some of it, I think the political tradition that he represents has a lot to say to our political moment. So yeah, could you just tell us, first of all, how do you understand Corbyn's worldview? Why does it differ from, what it's being accused to be by his enemies, and why does it matter in this particular historical juncture?
Great. Well, the central, I think, piece of misleading information that Jeremy Corbyn's opponents want you to have about Jeremy Corbyn's worldview is the idea that there's something very strange and almost kind of philanthropic about a British socialist who seems to care and has cared for many years about things happening in places far away all over the world. British voters care about their jobs and their homes and their security and livelihood here. And then there are these slightly awkward obsessives, sandal-wearing tea drinkers who care about the Palestinians and who care about dictatorships in South America and who don't want British bombs dropped over Iraq and Afghanistan. And that image is a powerful one. And the left is aware of it. There's a marvelous documentary about the murder of Fred Hampton, the Black Panther leader in America, in which he stands in a mock trial and says to this audience, after he's been accused of stealing some ice cream and the Black Panther Party put on a mock trial for him, and he says to this audience, they want you to hate people with who've got too much hair and beards, and because if you think that I'm the weirdo here, he says to working class white Americans, then it'll keep you punching down and targeting me and not targeting those in power. So the left is aware. I think Jeremy Corbyn and those around him are aware of the power of this narrative that says there's something weird and extreme about these radicals who care about fringe issues that don't matter to you. Actually, the political tradition Jeremy Corbyn comes from has always been the most insistent and steadfast in standing up for the rights, the liberties, the protections of people here very close to home in Britain, whether that's miners in red wall so-called constituencies now represented by Tory MPs, the party that shafted them while Jeremy Corbyn was visiting their picket lines, or whether it's pensioners or people who use the health service, or parents or teachers who rely on a decent state education system. So why is it that those who have been the most steadfast, the most reliable in standing up for people close to home are also the most steadfast and reliable at standing up for people overseas? I think you can only understand that connection if you junk entirely the miserable divisive worldview that tells you you must choose between caring about things close to home or caring, as Corbyn does, about distant causes. And instead understand that there are those who believe in a vision of human emancipation, a vision of freedom from domination that says people wherever they live should be able to live lives of dignity and freedom and security too, versus those who would patronize some among the working class of Britain with empty cultural appeals to their loyalty to the flag, would abandon others among the working class in Britain because they're not white enough or haven't been here long enough. Those people, the fair weather friends of the British working class who present themselves in a culture war framing as the real champions of the downtrodden as long as they're white, in fact are the champions of the downtrodden nowhere and never. And that is the message that I wanted to get out, that Jeremy Corbyn actually has the politics which stands up for those who need sorry, I know my internet connection is bad. Jeremy Corbyn has the politics that stands up for those who need his solidarity, wherever they are and whoever they are. And it's very different from the media representation that has been so effectively wielded against him.
This has changed slightly in recent years, though, hasn't it? I mean, you still get that. You still get the kind of the right that says, you know, we're about down-to-earth values. We care about local people with domestic issues. You know, it's that famous thing of why are we sending foreign aid abroad, ignoring the fact that foreign aid is a tool for diplomatic manipulation. Why are we sending that abroad when we have homegrown problems? And then famously, the right-wing politicians and pundits who argue this don't care about the homegrown problems either, right? But there is a new approach as well, which is to argue that there is something sinister and reactionary about support for anti-imperialism. So I saw this in the day that Jeremy Corbyn was suspended. There was a Guardian columnist who actually said, this is always the way it is with the so-called anti-imperialist left. They say they're anti-imperialist, and at the bottom of it, there's always anti-Semitism. There was also that bizarre incident where Jeremy Corbyn had written a short introduction to a book by a liberal theorist, from the turn of the century, and that text, though you know this was never really alluded to, is quite an instructive text in books like Lenin's, you know, writings on imperialism and stuff like that. Though he had crucial differences with it, and the attitude was, well, see, deep in the seedbed of these anti-imperialist commitments of this worldview, there is anti-Semitism. It's somehow related to a wider anti-Americanism. You know, there's a sort of convergence of the idea that, you know, anti-imperialism is an anti-democratic, probably racist, sinister project, which people like Corbyn want to foist on the country, you know, which would otherwise have no truck with it. So there's a bit of a change there, and what we've seen, I suppose, is a convergence between the arguments of the liberal parts of the liberal left and the right against anti-imperialism.
Though here again, if you think that those who would junk commitments to faraway places are really the champions of the poor and the oppressed closer to home, you're going to be sorely disappointed, because the same argument that is honed to say that anti-imperialism is a dodgy thing of which you should be suspicious because it might have undertones of conspiratorial racism, it might be anti-Semitic. I heard a segment on Newsnight the other night that sort of pissed me off just before I went on to be interviewed, saying that the left had once liked Jews, they had supported the state of Israel, but then the new left was anti-imperialist and so also anti-Semitic. You know, an awful, appalling kind of conflation, exactly the kind of conflation you're talking about. These same arguments are also used to say that a left that would challenge power and wealth close to home must be dodgy and suspicious and potentially anti-Semitic. You know, Siobhan McDonough, I think it was, a Labour MP, who said that anti-capitalism, told an interviewer that anti-capitalism might necessarily be anti-Semitic. A headmaster of a private school who complained that people objecting to the dominance of private school alumni in British public life were like Nazis trying to limit the number of Jews in public life. indeed, much of the contemporary anti-Semitism panic began in France, where it was targeted against young people rioting in the banlieue. So here again, what seems like a war against those who are committed to faraway struggles for justice also becomes a war against those who are committed to struggles for justice very close to home. And of course, this interests me as a way of panicking about and relating to the crisis of technocratic neoliberalism. So in a moment in which politics seems back and people want to talk again about power and wealth, conjuring as anti-Semitic in your mind, the spectre of anti-Semitism as the kind of hidden nasty edge to all politics that is anti-elitist and that has any kind of antagonism. This is a way for liberals to rescue the image of their own anti-racism, while in fact they attack the left. And it's deeply, deeply damaging because it risks glamorizing anti-Semitism and you know, by associating it with anti-imperialism or anti-capitalism. So it does huge damage. But it's also really damaging because it misreads anti-Semitism at a moment, the evidence suggests, of real rising anti-Semitism. I mean, incidentally, you raised the example of Hobson. Lenin's relationship to Hobson is a very good example of the difference between a universalist, emancipatory left and, are you with me? Because you froze for a second. I know my internet connection might be. Have you got me? Yeah, yeah. So Lenin's relationship to Hobson is a good example of the relationship between a universalist emancipatory left and anti-Semitic thinking, which is much more superficial in its supposed radicalism. Hobson thinks that imperialism is a kind of minor glitch, the fault of a few bad policy decisions that can be swatted away with some better management. Lenin thinks instead that it's a necessary stage of capitalist development. Now, you could agree or disagree with either of them, but clearly there, you see how the kind of worldview that spawns anti-Semitism is a worldview that says there's a small conspiracy easily swatted away and then everything will be fine again. And this doubtless does appear in politics frequently, including on the left. You know, you might have seen it around some of the Occupy stuff sometimes. You didn't say that Occupy was systematically anti-Semitic, of course not. But like the idea of a very limited superficial anti-capitalism where the problem's just a few bankers might then take the form of saying, and there's a cultural, racial, ethnic problem with those bankers, though it certainly doesn't always. Not all superficial politics is anti-Semitic politics, but it can be. The left, though, is precisely the best challenge to this kind of politics, because we say we need a much more fundamental account of capital as a structure of impersonal domination, not just a few individual bad apples called George Soros or Rothschild or whatever it is. So it's really, really damaging that in this attempt to tar the left with allegations of anti-Semitism, liberals would actually savage the one political force that not only has been consistently anti-racist, or more so than the liberals or the right, but also that has the answers to politics of resurgent anti-Semitism at a moment of crisis for technocracy and neoliberalism.
I think that's interesting because I agree with you that it's a unique tradition of Marxism that it has that kind of sort of monistic analysis that derives fundamentally from questions of the most fundamental questions of society, like how they reproduce themselves. And as you say, the impersonal relationships built upon those systems of production and reproduction. Whereas we now live in a world where, very unlike when I was young and when you were young, when critiques of capitalism were few and far between, it's quite rare now for public intellectuals and even politicians not to be critical of capitalism. But almost to an individual, their criticism of capitalism is sort of hyper-instrumentalist, like you described. So even at the 2008 financial crisis, you remember people saying, well, the problem isn't the economy, the problem is the financial bit, exactly. Right? Or even more kind of minoritarian, the problem isn't finance, the problem is that finance is dominated by men or privately educated people. But that was what the centre-left argued, because the centre-left didn't want to argue that there was a problem with capitalist reproduction that went right to the core of the economy and emanated right from the heartlands of the system and the most fundamental relationships that structure the system. Again, on the right, I mean, you've had a resurgence in popular kind of semi-critiques of capitalism, but all of them identify aspects of the whole. So it's not capitalism, it's globalism, right? It's the way we're doing it. It's there's a type of globalization which has gone feral or something like that. It never relates to the system as a whole. it is a challenge on the left to get that argument right, because there is a balance between, there are instrumental actors, there are instrumental sections of the system that break down at different times, but at the same time relating that to a vision of the whole. But I agree with you, and like you say, you can actually see that in the tension between Hobson and the Marxists who used some of his analysis but critiqued other parts. So yes, and the other side of this, that
can I just one thing
on.
about that quickly? I think because you just said something about how challenging it is now to do this. You know, it's easy for me to come along and say that the Marxist tradition is goes to the, Marx said, you know, to be radical is to go to the root. Lukács said the essence of Marxism is not stressing the economic side of things, but the point of view of totality, right? Rather than, anti-Semitism is clearly a failure of that point of view of totality. It wants instead to peel off a single layer of conspiratorial individuals who it imagines messing up everything. It doesn't have a real theory of the structure of social relations beyond conspiracy. It's easy to say we need that more ambitious theory. As you say, it's much more difficult now to work out both how to connect the real existence of agency of class forces and other people who do bad things in the world with that impersonal structure of reproduction. You know, how to talk about both of these things at once. There are some traditions of thinking about anti-Semitism, I think, around Moshe Stone, for example, that stress only the impersonal and castigate any attempt to talk about agency and politics in the world. So that's one real challenge. But the huge challenge of our moment is how Lukács could talk about totality and its overthrow in a moment of European revolution in the early 20th century, in which he saw a proletarian subject which was, he thought, the identical subject-object of history and was going to overturn this whole thing. It's much more difficult, I think, and this is the real reason anti-Semitism interests me as someone whose research is about the decline of thinking about the end of capitalism. It's more difficult to work out how we face off against reactionary anti-capitalisms with an emancipatory anti-capitalism in a moment where it's harder to identify who the subjects are, what the standpoint is from which to overturn the whole thing and what that would even look like. So I think that is our difficulty, and it's in that moment that forms of anti-elitist politics that are less radical have great purchase, because the total claim, let's storm the Winter Palace and get rid of everything, just doesn't seem feasible anymore. I think that's the challenge that the left has to engage in, the reality of anti-Semitism.
Yeah,
I
agree.
But other forms of so-called populist, right-wing, supposed radicalisms. Sorry, go on.
I agree with that, because the danger of having a theory which is simply floated away into abstraction and which doesn't connect with real political, demands and with the really articulated picture of a capitalist system that people actually come into contact with. If you just present people with the abstractions of the impersonal relationships, they're sort of like, well, that's not what my world looks like. Do you know what I mean? And it also, you can end up with a version of Marxism which is a dead letter, which, is good for chin stroking, but it doesn't actually relate to the way in which the capitalist system functionally, concretely, reproduces itself. And I think it does have particular challenges in this period, but it's always had challenges. I mean, you've always had people who have argued, for example, that well, if there's a military junta in charge, it can't be capitalism because the capitalists aren't in charge. I was thinking about this in relation to the United States, where behind Biden is organised a group of corporate interests which looks more like direct capitalist rule than I've perhaps ever seen in liberal democracy. And the other form of rule is represented by a bizarre, ridiculous outrider who's a sort of charismatic presence, but who mobilizes relatively little capitalist support compared to his opponents. So there's always that problem with uniting the abstract theorization with the particular real political juncture. There's one other kind of issue with this that I want to discuss with you, because it drives me mental, which is when you hear people argue, well, I remember someone saying this, directly to me. Of course, Marxism ended up incubating, and leftism in general, incubating anti-Semitic elements, because its arguments are that a small group of bankers and merchants and media figures and etc., control the world in their own interests. And what I think people routinely misunderstand, and of course, and they say, and that's what the Nazis said. What people don't understand is the fascist version of anti-Semitism, the Action Française version, the Italian version, much more kind of, you know, at its kind of peak, the kind of German version, was a response to the socialist movement. It's not the other way around, which a lot of people have, you know, and it's the most irresponsible thing to see, for example, you know, liberal journalists reproducing this attitude that the socialist movement emerged out of anti-Semitism when the opposite is the case, that you had in the late part of the 1900s and the early part of the 20th century, the coherence of a powerful socialist movement with working class organization, and they had an argument and a critique of elemental power, you know, based on class politics. So, you know, it's an obvious response to that politics that reactionary thinkers and demagogues and organizers would say, you know, the problem's not the bankers, the problem's the Jewish bankers. The problem's not the capitalists, the problem is the Jewish capitalist, and so on. It's an enormous, you know, failing of contemporary history that hasn't been communicated.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, yeah, the response to that argument that would associate the left with anti-Semitism for its, because both the left and anti-Semites are read on this view as punching up, challenging power. The response to that, and there's just so much I'd like to say about it, but just briefly, I think it's worth saying two distinct things, both of which you've touched on. One is, I read the other day an essay by Karl Popper, the classic anti-Marxist intellectual, on conspiracy theory. And I scanned it for some kind of reference to Marxism as a form of this pathology of conspiracy theory, thinking that a few people run the world. In Popper's view, this crazy anti-pluralistic pathology. And I couldn't find any reference to Marxism until I find a footnote, which says, some of you might wonder why I haven't included Marxism in my study of conspiracy theory, but of course I haven't, because Marxism is not a form of conspiracy theory, says even Karl Popper, its critic, inclined to celebrate a kind of liberal pluralism. Because obviously Marxism is a theory of a social form, of a social whole, a social totality, which has these organic, impersonal dynamics towards accumulation, valorization, alienation, exploitation. This is, in other words, not a question of a healthy social world polluted by a tiny number of bad people. Marx says, you know, the capitalist is only the bearer of capital. It is capital itself which is the subject, not the individual capitalist. If the individual capitalist decides to be really lovely and nice, that doesn't make the world better. He just goes out of business if he pays his workers too much. So Marxism is not a theory of a few bad apples. It's a theory about the barrel. And anti-Semitism is a theory of a few bad apples ruining a healthy barrel. That's why it is such a conservative response to left-wing thinking that tries to salvage the image of society by saying the problem's quite superficial. That's the first huge difference between Marxism as a theory of social totality, a social theory, and anti-Semitism as a kind of merely political theory of a few individuals acting on the world. But of course, the second error is exactly the one you mentioned, which is it is extremely misleading to leap over the difference between saying there are a few people who do great damage in the world and hold power, which might be a shallow account of the world, less sophisticated than Marxian social theory. It might be like Bernie Sanders just talking about billionaires or something. But there's still there's a world of difference between that. There are a few people in the world who are powerful and do damage. And on the other hand, what makes those people do damage is something in their blood, or something in their religion, something in their culture or their ethnicity, which, in other words, rules out the possibility of a kind of universal emancipation. We want to change the world so that these people don't occupy these positions of power and harm anymore, and they are emancipated too. Instead, you have a picture in which you either have to just annihilate them, because they're like essentially, you know, your enemies, or you have to like, you know, persuade them to adopt your cultural values and, you know, remove their burqas if you're in France, or, you know, treat their workers better like some good Anglo-Saxon boss, or whatever it is. So it is extremely misleading to ignore the difference between accounts of power in the world, which might be shallow and might be insufficient, but which treat powerful people as powerful by virtue of their constructed position in a set of social relations, or on the other hand, accounts of power which think that the problem is racial or ethnic or cultural. And those sorts of accounts are, I think, wholly reactionary, even though sometimes they can appear on the left, but they are not accounts that really belong on the left.
And I'm interested as well in the way in which those kind of essentialisms have a strange mirror in some of the attitudes which I think are used against Corbyn, and even some which within the left have undermined a robust response to this type of attack. It must be said, of course, Corbyn has been, victimised in this campaign, as have others. That doesn't mean, of course, that there aren't real instances of anti-Semitism. But I think that part of the reason there has been a very weak response in parts of the left to this campaign is not a recognition of those real instances. I think it's rather a fear of, it's a few things. People are motivated by different things. But I think one thing is people have been won over to an argument that says, for example, when criticisms are made by quote unquote the Jewish community, they must be accepted by the non-Jewish community as legitimate or perhaps even simply true. Now, these are ideas which I think are connected to a wider body of thought, owing it in some parts to postmodernism. I don't think they're that straightforward. I think that there's kind of a gloop of kind of postmodern thought around the left on these kind of questions about identity and communities and who speaks for who and from what vantage point can truth be understood, and so on. And I just feel like there has been an overly essentialist narrative adopted around these ideas, which I think goes much wider than the left. I was talking to Cy Engler, I don't know if you saw this video in relation to this in France, where it's now become utterly commonplace from left to right to say things like, the French believe in laicite, but the Muslims care about blasphemy. What a culture clash, right? Likewise, the Jewish community in Britain is afraid of Jeremy Corbyn, right? Well, some are his defenders, some are completely agnostic on the issue, and a dozen other positions that it's possible for people to take. How does and I said I would relate this coincidentally to what's going on in the United States, where if you remember back in 2016, if you said, this is not just about white supremacy, that there is a wider body of ideas in play here. You may have been derided if you said something like, well, I think this stuff about economic anxiety isn't just a euphemism. I think it speaks to a deeper truth about class politics in the contemporary United States, and that there's an interaction between anxieties about social class and position and income and economic position and so on, and other identities like being white or being a man or being a heterosexual or whatever. These things can relate together. 4 years later in American politics, it seems, it kind of just makes you wish, I wish we'd fought harder on these, a battle of ideas around these questions before now, because I'm now watching people say, the white gay community has betrayed the black gay community and so on. And you're just thinking, this is, this is not a coherent way to view people's political motivations or to build a coalition for any kind of social progress.
Yeah, it looks like in this US election, the one demographic in which Trump's vote went down and the Democratic vote went up was white men. I saw someone I have on Facebook called Josh Kitto, I don't actually know if that's his real name, remarking that, but smart guy I have on Facebook, remarking that the one Democratic candidate who in recent years has won a plurality of white male support, was the black guy whose preacher said, "God damn America." I'm obviously not nostalgic, particularly for Obama, but he was not a candidate designed to, the black guy whose middle name was Hussein was not a candidate designed on this superficial view of whiteness to appeal. to that demographic. And indeed, that was a fear that Hillary Clinton tried to mobilize consistently in the 2008 primary, where she said ordinary Americans, white Americans, would be turned off Obama. You know, it was a common narrative associating him with radicalism and Bill Ayers and is he a Muslim? And yet he won, it looks like, more white support than Hillary Clinton and possibly Joe Biden. And I think John Kerry too. These very bland, unchallenging figures to this image of whiteness. So clearly we need a more subtle account of how people in America think about politics than one which is just reduced to their race. And as you say, that links to a broader point about politics. I never know quite what people mean when they use the word postmodernism, so I'm not gonna pull you up on that. But it is absolutely true, I think, that we have succumbed to a way of thinking about politics that is surely indebted to kind of demographic pollsters, in which we slot people into communities and then think that they will behave in some unitary, homogenous way. And that is naive at best, dangerous at worst. And it's also the case that we treat those communities as essentialized given identities that so we don't ask any questions about their historical construction. If you were to ask about what it means to think about British Jewish community hostility to Jeremy Corbyn, and start asking that by taking very seriously the idea that anti-Semitism is something to worry about, not something to be dismissed, right? But if you ask why is it that there is such a campaign from the Board of Deputies and the Jewish Chronicle of fears, genuine fears about Jeremy Corbyn, well, partly you'll tell a story about the construction of community that is less simple than just a homogenous thing, and you'll see how there is also a Jewish left and there are also lots of Jews who don't care, as you say. That's true. But you'll also have to tell a historical story which has analogies. I was campaigning in the 2019 election in some areas with high British Indian, Hindu populations, and I saw fears about Labour's support announced at their 2019 conference for freedom for Kashmir. And people interpreted that as a kind of veil for anti-Indian racism, anti-Hindu racism. And here I was struck by the analogy. Here you have a community which has historically been in the crosshairs of European nation states, historically systematically oppressed, and which understood its liberation and its security in a post-colonial world to be bound up with the construction of a nation state. And that nation state is then involved in oppressing others. And so people from that community easily, understandably, can feel paranoid and anxious about demands for freedom for that new oppressed group as being just a veil, a mask to attack them. So I was struck by the analogy in fears about Labour's support for Kashmir and fears about Corbyn's support for Palestine, that you have a community that feels itself to be precarious and has various anxieties. You won't speak to those anxieties and think about them carefully if you either just homogenize and say everyone in this group thinks the same thing, or treat it as, and this is a very similar move, treat it as a given, unalterable fact about the world that they just think this because of something in their blood or something. You have to instead treat carefully the historical construction of these anxieties in order to try to work out how we can challenge them and unsettle those anxieties, rather than just taking them at their word and saying we couldn't possibly engage with them in any kind of constructive way. Yeah, I think there's a real problem in contemporary ways of talking about race, identity, community, and racism.
Yeah, I think it relates to this kind of decline of universalism. I suppose I don't want to get into a tedious theoretical argument about postmodernism, but I suppose that's where I see that coming in, is there's almost a kind of sense of if you don't accept the world just being made up of a fragmentation of kind of hardened particularisms, then you're making dangerous claims about who people are, and these claims are ignorant about people's real identities and so on. So, as you say, there's never been this kind. I think there's been a decline in general in this in a belief in political leadership and in winning arguments. That's a thing that happens. That we're not just appealing to constituencies. That when I go to so if I campaign, if I door knock in an Indian community of British Indians, or if I campaign in a community where British Jews live, if I campaign in a community where, you know, people of Irish background come from, I don't make the same case to all three groups. I don't say, well, here are my principled politics on the national question or on questions of racism or questions of oppression. to each and every single group and say, and this is universally true for the entire democratic project. It's universally true for what's progressive for all of humanity. The scary politics that's built into this is, no, you need to tell people what they want to hear, and not challenge them, because to challenge them, to challenge ideas can be offensive. To challenge ideas can be, and you see a lot of this in terms of, in relation to Marxism. Marxism is a European mode of thought. Don't try and impose it on anti-colonial movements, for example, as though these things are not translatable among a humanity that is fundamentally universal, that has fundamental, coherent, universal themes, needs, interests that can be brought into the same project.
A good example is the move from a language of solidarity to a language of allyship, because allyship says you face a particular set of challenges. I, as a kind of alien to you, who will always necessarily be an alien to you, there's nothing I can do about that. All I can do is, from my distant standpoint, pat you on the back and say I give you my support. Solidarity, on the other hand, says you face a particular set of challenges which may appear radically different from mine, but I want to find common, I want to find links that can allow us to say that we face common enemies and we're going to beat them together. And that work of solidarity is often a vague and aspirational thing. It's often hard to work out what really puts me as a British Jew and my friend as a British Muslim in the same struggle, because and claims that we all hate racism can appear quite kind of abstract and not very rooted in the material challenges that we face that might look very different. So it's hard to work out links of solidarity. But again, to return to our earlier point about totality, if you believe that there is some kind of structuring principle of the social world that you want to overturn, and which in some perhaps complex way makes itself felt in all kinds of different domains, if that's what you think capitalist society is, that the commodity structure and the value form, and also imperialism and racism, and the complex connection between these things are presences that fold out across our social world. If you believe that, then you have to move away from a language of allyship that thinks that we're radically different, and try to work out how to hone again a language of solidarity that can be meaningful, because it can find genuine common antagonists and common struggles against them. I don't think that's easy, in thinking that different communities are fixed bubbles with their own interests and needs, and there's no possibility of any kind of unity for common ends between us.
Okay, I'm going to leave on that point, because I think it's a very relevant one, both for the situation in this country and for the situation in the United States, about which we can't really comment very much more until we see what's going on. The situation was rapidly changing before I came onto the Zoom call, so I'm gonna get back to it. But thanks very much for this conversation. I think it's been really useful, and I'd love to take it up again at some future point, because I think these are exactly some of the themes that we need to develop on the left in the coming years.
Thank you so much. It's been wonderful. There's so much more to say, so I look forward to speaking more. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. And folk can go to conta.co.uk to read more about all these debates. I'd invite you to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and I look forward to speaking to you all again soon. Cheers.